Welcome to the Historical Romance Sampler Podcast. I'm your host, Katherine Grant, and each week I introduce you to another amazing historical romance author. My guest reads a little sample of their work, and then we move into a free-ranging interview. If you like these episodes, don't forget to subscribe to the Historical Romance Sampler wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Now, let's get into this week's episode.
All right, I am super excited to be joined today by Carol Coventry. Carol Coventry is the romance writing alter ego for historical novelist Susan Coventry. A quarter of a century working in the medical field has taught her that after any tough day, nothing soothes the spirit like a guaranteed happily ever after. Escaping to the Regency era is like a mini vacation, and after she spent so much time there, she felt like a native and began spinning her own tales of historical romance. After winning the grand prize in Dragon Blade's Right Track contest, Carol published Counting on Love, the first in her series, The Taverstons of Iversley. Carol, I'm so excited to have you here today.
Happy to be here.
So you are reading for us from Counting on Love. What should we know about the story before we get started?
Okay, so this is Counting on Love. It is the first in a 4-book series, as you said, The Taverstons of Iversley. And it's a slow burn and what I call a low steam but not no steam love story. And the blue stocking heroine and a beta hero. So what you need to know first is that the heroine, Lady Georgiana Stuart, is a duke's daughter, and she's being courted by Lord Jasper Taverston, who is the heir to the Earl of Iversley. And Georgiana is beautiful and charming, and Jasper is handsome and charming, and everybody in the town thinks they're going to make a perfect match. But what the people don't know is that Georgiana is a math genius, and it's something that she has had to hide all her life because ladies don't do math. And then the other problem that she's having is she's finding Jasper to be a bit dull. However, Jasper invites her to their family's country estate, and she goes, and there she meets his 2 brothers, Crispin and Reginald. Reginald is the 3rd son, and he's considered to be the brilliant brother. He's a Greek scholar, but he has recently been tapped by Jasper to straighten out the family's account books. And they're in a mess because the steward has recently died. So that's kind of where the story is picking up. And I said it's a slow burn, and that's because Georgiana is being courted by Jasper. So she and Reginald are very careful in how they interact with each other, and they kind of fall for one another's intelligence and personalities before they'll realize or admit to each other that there's a growing sexual attraction between them. So I'm going to read from the scene where Georgiana realizes that she's falling in love with Reginald.
Awesome.
The library door was wide open, and so were the curtains. Reginald was seated on a spindly chair that matched the one in the second little nook. Georgiana knocked lightly on the doorframe, then went in. Reginald's head came up from his ledger. He didn't look particularly happy to see her, but neither did he look displeased. She held up the plate. Crispin was in the breakfast parlor, trying to read a newspaper. He sent me here with these for you. I must have been annoying him. Crispin is shockingly easy to annoy. Come in, come. He stood up. Whereas I am pleasant to anyone bearing cook's roles. She crossed the carpet and joined him in the nook. Then she realized at once that she shouldn't have. He wasn't wearing a cravat, and the top button of his shirt was undone. She set the plate down, intending to leave directly, but the ledger over which she had been hunched was surrounded by scratch paper and scribbled calculations, and she couldn't tear herself away. Of course, Reginald would notice her lingering. She imagined it was hard for him not to. Leaving a plate of rolls should only have taken a moment. He gestured to the papers. Does this mess make your head hurt? She knew he was not referring to the splash of papers, but rather the inefficient figures upon them. But she refused to be so thin-skinned as to now imagine he was mocking her. I confess it does. Why are you spending so much time on accounts? Surely you have a steward. He rubbed his stubbled cheek. This sleepy, somewhat rumpled look was oddly attractive on him. Of course, she'd never seen a gentleman so must. Yet somehow she didn't believe she'd find dishevelment attractive in any other man. Faith, this train of thought was terribly inappropriate. She forced herself to focus on his words. We did. The man passed recently and hadn't been keeping up for several months. I don't think it was topmost in Jasper's mind until he saw how muddled it had become. But surely he doesn't expect you to be his steward. Oh no, Jasper's expectations are more in line with my father's. Fairly medieval ones. First son heir, second son soldier. She finished the triad. Third son to the church? He nodded, then yawned before sitting wearily back down. Jasper has a man in mind to take over, but he wanted the books a bit cleaner before handing them off. And then? Then? What will you do with yourself? She couldn't really see him as a clergyman. What would you be doing if you weren't poring over these ledgers? He hesitated, then gestured to a leather case on the floor. It was the clasped one she had noted before. In there, I have a manuscript in ancient Greek that was presumably meticulously copied by monks a few hundred years ago. If Bastian is correct, Frederick Bastian? Yes, by God, how do you? My brother Charles has mentioned him. I've only heard the name. Sorry, go on. He gazed at her a moment as if he were going to say something different, but then continued. If he's correct, there was no one alive today who knows what these manuscripts say. Plural manuscripts? He has 12 of them. And you are going to learn what they say. Oh, now this. Gooseflesh rose on her arms. Well, a few pages of one. He rubbed his hands down his thighs and smiled ruefully. After that, I suppose I will settle into a living at Framingham. But, he tapped the ledger, I have forbidden myself to work on the Greek until I get these accounts sorted. It occurred to her that she could sort them out for him, but putting her nose into the Taverstons' finances would be heinous. It would also be fun. Are you even almost finished? I thought I was. He shook his head. I was rattled yesterday by that mistake of 8 versus 5. What if I'd been sloppy reading others' handwriting? So I've been double checking some of the receipts, and they look correct, but what if they're not? I really don't want to go through them all again. Then I remembered what you said about patterns. What I said? Yes, most of the expenses are for the same thing over and over. If the cost was the same each time, I wouldn't have to sum it up all each time. Well, obviously. But the cost is not always the same. Sometimes it's more, sometimes less. I'd have to look deeper into the invoices to see why. And, well, the devil, it's too boring to contemplate. She laughed lightly. I can imagine. So I went back to assuming the entries I made were correct and just tallying them to get the whole thing finished. He pointed to his scratch paper. And I shouldn't have been working on it so late because none of my sums came out the same twice. You should have gone to bed. Yes, but then here's the worst of it. When I started this whole project, I thought I'd be clever and start by looking at the account books from 5 years ago. Bradwell was taking care of things then, so I decided I would simply do as he did. That makes sense. But because I have become so hopelessly muddled that I can't even add and subtract anymore, last night, I thought I'd go back to that first book and just tally the columns. He frowned, like a schoolboy exercise. I'd call that a drastic measure. She picked up one of the rolls and broke off a piece, but she was fidgety, not hungry, so she set the bread down. I hope you aren't redoing all the books for the past 5 years. It wasn't my intention, but now, he pulled his hand through his hair. I was up all night. She tried not to think of him sitting there through the night. There was something more intimate about that than picturing him in bed, which she would never do. Reginald opened a worn book with a frayed cover and pushed it in front of her on the desk. He pointed to a column. Please tell me I'm wrong. Georgiana drew a breath, debating whether to look, but she knew she was going to. It was either look at the page or at the base of Reginald's throat, right there in front of her. She turned to calculating the costs and revenues and then compared her result to the total that had been recorded at the bottom. That is incorrect. The significance of that fact gave her a cold, heavy feeling in the pit of her stomach. Have you another ledger, another year? He pulled out another from a short stack on his desk and opened it to a page he had dog-eared. 6 years ago, randomly selected quarter, this page. She ran her finger down the column, then looked into Reginald's pallid face. Oh, she said, full of sympathy, but unsure what else to say. They were each off by 30 pounds. If that was true of every quarter, the books were off by 120 pounds a year, for who knew how many years. Damn it, he swore. I'm sorry. I should not have burdened you. God, if I wasn't so tired, I'm sorry. It's inexcusable. I just hoped I was wrong and you would. She waved his protest away. How many have you checked? 3 quarters from randomly pulled years. And they're all off? He nodded. Not always by the same amounts, but usually close. Maybe I'm wrong, he heaved a sigh. But if I am, it's not by much. I was concentrating on the numbers without paying much attention to what they were for. So after I talked to you, I realized I should be looking for patterns, but he waved a hand towards the bookshelf where she had seen rows and rows of old ledgers. It will take years. If your steward was dipping, but he wasn't, not Bradwell, I would stake my life on his honesty and his competence. I can't make sense of it. She said nothing. His father's steward had been stealing from the family, and now the man was dead and nothing could be done. And his father was dying. Reginald wanted to do this one simple thing, and it had devolved into a nightmare. He murmured, and I feel as if I could just decipher the books. Oh, Reginald, Her heart broke for the man because she knew he wanted to do what he loved, what he lived for, and was instead trying to reconcile himself to doing what was expected. Gently, she said, "It's not ancient Greek. You can't translate it." No, it's not Greek, unfortunately. It's numbers. Numbers. Oh God, Georgiana, no, I'm not asking you. Of course I'm not. I'm just bemoaning my own inadequacy. I know Bradwell is not an embezzler, but something is not right. And I'm concerned this is something that will come back to haunt Jasper. He should at least know there's something hidden. And the answer is in those books somewhere. The money came in, it went out. It has to add up. He could not have seduced her more effectively than that. I'll help you. I can't ask that. Reginald, you can't put something like this in front of me and then snatch it away. It would be as if Bastian took away that manuscript and said, never mind. He looked at her hard, then shook his head. Bradwell was the family's accountant for 47 years. 47. Do you know how many ledgers that spans? Jasper's not going to let me lock you away in the library. Reginald, for hours at a time, days on end, he has a million things planned. Reginald, I don't think he'll notice. She looked down at her hands and willed them not to tremble with excitement. It won't take me all that long. Lady Georgiana Stewart realized she had just made an unimaginably arrogant statement about her own mathematical abilities. Yet the scholarly gentleman sitting before her did not shy away, grimacing with distaste. He smiled. It was not only the turn of his lips, but the way his sky at dust blue eyes suddenly appeared to be lit from behind, crinkling at the corners. It took her breath away. He said, I won't get in your way. Just tell me what you'll need. Oh, at best, she'd expected him to hand her a stack of ledgers and fire off a plodding set of instructions, then breathe down her neck. Because what else could she have expected him to do? But this man, this unbearably marvelous, sensible man, ceded control over a problem with a smile to a woman. It came to her all at once, a revelation. This is the one. Her mind began reeling back to every interaction, every moment they'd shared since he'd frightened her awake and they'd contrived to lie to their loved ones. She had known then. And later, when he took it upon himself to put that horse out of its misery, and when he had watched her do sums in her head and been impressed rather than appalled, rather than intimidated. Well, no, she was easy to look back and believe she had known all along, but she knew she hadn't. And she couldn't be in love with him. She had only known him for less than a week. But she could love him, given time. At once came the horrified realization that she would love him, given time. She could not marry Lord Jasper Taverston.
Whoa! What a pivotal scene, and I don't know that account books have ever been so sexy. Well, I have a lot of questions for you, but first we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. Do you love to find historical romance book deals? Or are you an author who would like to boost a new release or discount to readers who love historical romance? Historical Romance Book Deals was made for you. Historical Romance Book Deals is a daily newsletter that showcases free books, discounts, and new releases. It's great for readers to find new books and for authors to spread the word about their books. Authors, while HRBD grows their list, you can submit your books for free. Simply visit historicalromancebookdeals.com and use the coupon code HRBDFree. Hey, audiobook listeners! Have you checked out the official Historical Romance Sampler Season 1 playlist on Libro.fm? On the playlist, you'll find historical romances you heard here first that are available to listen to on Libro.fm. Plus, if you're not yet a Libro.fm subscriber, use code HISTORICAL to get extra credits in your first month. Head on over to the Historical Romance Sampler Linktree to learn more. I'm back with Carol Coventry, who just read a very fun and mathematical excerpt from Counting on Love. So I just adore being in the headset of Georgiana, who finds it fun to do accounts and is lusting over her math as much as she's lusting over Reginald. And it just occurred to me that they didn't have calculators in the Regency, and how on earth does anyone handle that? So I guess I'd like to start by finding out, I know that, as Susan Coventry, you write historical fiction. And so what is your approach to research when you approach historical romance? And did you, for example, go down a rabbit hole on do they have calculators?
So, yeah, I always, for both the historical fiction and the historical romance, I always way over research and spend far too much time doing it. I love the research aspects. And I think with historical romance, more so than with historical fiction, the trick is leaving most of that out. When I started with the historical romance, I got most of my feel for it by just reading other historical romances. And it wasn't until, so I felt like I had a framework for it. But It wasn't until I start writing that I go, oh, I need to know this or I need to know that. And then I would really dig into the research.
Yeah. And so you were researching as you were writing, and what is your personal approach to the tightrope of historical accuracy versus telling a fun story?
I really want to be as accurate as possible. There are times when your research doesn't really bear out what you think you knew. And then it's tough to go with, well, if everybody thinks this, should I just stick with this or should I throw this loop in there that goes, well, I have some actual research that I'm never going to be able to explain to you, but that I know that this is right. So that's kind of where I find the tightrope to walk, is when to go with your gut versus what you just read.
Do you have an example of that?
One of the examples would be when the London season would occur. And most often we think, well, it starts in the spring and runs through the summer. And that makes it a lot nicer than to imagine people slogging through the wet and the snow. But when I was looking at, okay, so when did it start and when does it end? And it was more variable than that. And kind of earlier from my understanding, earlier on in the Regency period, it was not as set as it was later on in the Victorian period. And it really corresponded with when Parliament was in session, because that's when all the lords and ladies had to come back into London to be there for Parliament. And so that's when they would have their parties. So sometimes it would happen over the winter. They would be there in the winter. And so then I looked up when was Parliament in session during this, 1812, 1813, and they were in session over the winter time. So I had the season start in the winter, which was difficult because then you are picturing them slogging about in the mud. So
Yeah, I've run into that as well, where it's like, wait a second, I have this idea of the season as a concept, and then when you match up the dates, it's like, oh.
mhm.
Also, like if it's really hot, like weren't they leaving and was everyone there? It is interesting to match up the historical texts with the genre texts.
Yeah.
So, Counting on Love is your first historical romance. You'd been writing historical fiction before that. So I'm curious, what does writing historical romance afford you, the author, creatively or personally or whatever, compared to writing historical fiction?
The thing I love about historical romance is the guaranteed happily ever after. And when I started reading a lot of romance, it was really for that escape. And that is kind of, you go through it and you get all nervous about it. And then you go, they're going to end up together. So relax, they're going to end up together. And the focus is really on that love relationship. And so it's really kind of two different sides of my brain. The one that just wants the relaxation and the fun and the dialogues. And then the other side that goes, but history is really a lot more complex than that. And there's a lot of unpleasantness in historical fiction. And a lot of that you don't really want to bring into romance. So romance is my escape.
Yeah. And you mentioned that this is low but no steam. Is there steam in your historical fiction? And do you approach steam differently when writing your historical romances?
Yes, I think I go with about the same level of steam in both. And that's, well, I guess, the book that I'm having come out in November, that's not romance. There's love in there and there's references to sex, but you never see them, like it's very closed door. And in the Regency, in the romances, I have the door like ajar and you can kind of peek in, but you're not in there with them. So I don't think my approach is all that different with the steam level in romance versus general historical fiction.
Yeah. Was it fun for you to kind of say, oh, I can lean into this and open that door a little bit? Or was it
Mm,
an awkward,
it's more,
uncomfortable?
yeah, it's more uncomfortable, and I think it's because I'm always thinking about readers that I know, and so, I mean, that was really difficult for me while I was still working, and thinking, oh, I don't want to go in and see these people tomorrow if they've read my sex scene last night. So I find that as long as I don't think about people actually reading it, then I can write sex. Otherwise, I don't want to think about it.
Yes. Yes, I am very familiar with that. And in your setup for this book, and also it was kind of coming through in the text, Georgiana and Reginald actually are reacting to each other in a different way than society expects attraction to work, which is that Georgiana is attracted to Reginald because he's this brilliant person, and he's attracted to her because she's brilliant, not because she's this cheerful, beautiful debutante that is the perfect match for his brother. And I heard that and I kind of had this filter of like, oh, you're exploring sapiosexuality or demisexuality. And I wondered, did you have those, labels, for lack of a better word, in mind, or is that something that I'm bringing and applying and projecting onto your characters?
I very much had those two labels in mind when I was
Okay.
writing. And that was part of, I wanted to see if I could do it. But then after I had written the book, I'm like, I don't want to put those labels on them because I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to be saying, oh, this is a sapiosexual and a demisexual and have people go, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. So I stayed away from the labels, even though that's kind of what I was going for.
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert, but I think you you conveyed that. And
Right.
I think, I've written a character before where I didn't really want to say this is what a demisexual person experiences, but I've also found it really interesting to try to write that character in the context of romance books because we have so many beats that are expected by readers and are like physical markers of attraction.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that go for you as you were exploring these two, you know, alternate versions of attraction coming together?
Mm-hmm. I think this is why it took them a while to get together because I really needed them to see those aspects in each other that would eventually kind of pull on those lust strings, right? I mean, it took a while, but they got there because they were entranced by one another, and then the sexual attraction came after that.
Yeah, yeah. That's cool. That's really cool. So, who are some of the historical romance authors that you kind of think about when you're writing historical romance as that you want to emulate or who are influencing your work?
I kind of cut my teeth on Georgette Hare. I don't even know how to pronounce her name, but she was the one that really made me start reading a lot of romance. I just loved her stuff. Reading it, now there's things that are problematic about it that you kind of have to like look away from now because she wrote way back in like the 20s. But more recent things, I love Mary Baylog. I love the depth of emotion that she can bring out in her characters. I love Mimi Matthews. I think she's got really great plotting, and she also does closed door kind of romances. So she can pull out that kind of sexual tension without going into the sex. I like Mary Lancaster, who she writes really nice, just Regency romance or historical romance, but she also does historical mysteries where you can kind of follow the couple as they through a couple of
That's
mysteries.
fun.
I love that too. So yeah, I mean, I think the ones that I would like to emulate the most are the ones that really get dialogue and kind of that banter really well. That's what I love reading, and it's what I would hope to be able to write.
Yeah. Is that what kind of hooks you into a story, or do you start more from characters or a plot idea?
It starts for me in the writing, it starts more from like a scene. I'll have like a scene in my head, and it's usually the reconciliation scene that kind of comes into my mind first. And so then I got to kind of work back from that to go, okay, why did they break up? And what brought them to this point? So I do kind of start with characters and a single plot point and then go from there.
That's cool to start with. That breakup gives you a lot of momentum to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think we can move to Love It or Leave It. All right. Love It or Leave It. The protagonists meet in the first 10% of the novel.
I'm going to swim against the current on this one and say leave it. And that's most books that I read, and the books 2 through 4 that I wrote, they either know each other from the beginning or they meet right at the beginning. But I think to me, it's more important that the reader gets introduced to the two characters right away than it is that the two characters get introduced to each other right away. And that's what, in Counting on Love, it takes a while before they meet because she meets Jasper first. And what I really want is my readers to fall in love with the characters first and then watch them and go along for the ride as they fall in love with each other.
All right. Love It or Leave It. Dual point of view narration.
That's a love it.
All right. A love it or leave it, third person past tense.
That's also a love it. For romance especially, I think that just works best.
Love it or leave it, third act breakup or dark moment.
I love that there is a dark moment and a substantial breakup that you think, oh, they're never going to get back from this. But I don't necessarily think it has to be in the third act. I think it can happen even a couple times during the book. So,
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Love it or leave it, always end with an epilogue.
I'd say leave it for that also. I don't need an epilogue for every story. I do kind of like at the end of a series to have an epilogue and kind of a little wrap up and see where all the characters are, but I don't need one every book.
All right. Love it or leave it, share research in your author's note.
That for me in the romances, it's a leave it, but in general historical fiction, then it's a love it.
Oh, interesting. Is there a reason why you don't like it in romances?
Well, I kind of, like I said, I try not to overburden the romances with all this great stuff that I found during my research. And I don't want to just use the author's note as just a dump to put in all that stuff because I couldn't work it into the story. It's just too much. So, with the happily ever after, it kind of feels like it's done. When the story's done, it's done. So that's it. Whereas with general historical fiction, there is so much more stuff. And you want to say, okay, this, why I chose to use this piece of history versus that one. So it just seems more like there's more of a need for it in the general stuff.
Interesting. All right. And are there any other romance rules I didn't ask about that you like to break or play with?
So the one that I played with mostly in the next book in Holding On to Love is timeline or chronology. And usually with romances, I don't know if it's a rule, but what generally happens is you start at the beginning and march on through to the end. And in Holding On to Love, it doesn't do that. And so I like playing around with the timeline and the structure. It starts kind of right where Counting on Love is ending. But by that time, the two characters, which would be Jasper and his mistress, have broken up. And so the present timeline of that book is that they have to get back together. They're apart and they have to get back together. But there's also the whole story, the whole backstory of them falling in love in the first place. So this kind of goes back and forth in chapters so that we can see them in both timelines. And that's not something that I generally see in romance, but I wanted to try it in this one. So I broke that rule, I guess.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I am curious to read that and see how that works out. Well, thank you for playing Love It or Leave It. I have enjoyed hearing about how you approach these romance rules. So where can our listeners find you and your books, The Taverstons of Iversley?
The best place to find more is to go to my website at susancoventry.com. And that will have a link kind of at the top of the page to my newsletter, so you can get hooked up with that. I also have a blog at susancoventryblogspot.com where I review a lot of books. So if you want to kind of see what I'm reading, which is all over the map, you can look at my blog. But the starting place would be my website.
Awesome. And I will put a link to your website in the show notes. So listeners, you can head on and click through.
All right. Thank you.
Carol, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a blast and I'm excited. Counting on Love is out. Is Holding On to Love out?
Holding On to Love is out. And then the third book in the series, Waiting for Love, comes out March 14th.
Okay, so by the time that this episode airs, Waiting for Love will be out as well. So listeners, you can go consume 3 out of the 4 books in the series and get really excited for book 4. Yeah. So, all right, well, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. It was fun.
That's it for this week. Don't forget to subscribe to the Historical Romance Sampler wherever you listen, and follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Until next week, happy reading.